All right, if you could start making your way back to your seats, please. We're going to get started in another minute or two. Have to go in the back and start going like this. Yes, it should be. Yeah, do you want to just give it a shot? Because we also need to check the. Okay. Why is it not? That's the one, right? Is it a YouTube clip? I can just pull it up. Let's do that. There we go. All right. Okay, so everybody found their way back. We're going to start with our next presentation, Dr. Benjamin Miller, uh, In God's Presence, Chaplains, Missionaries, and Religious Space During the American Civil War. We still have a few copies of the book left outside, so if you are so inspired after this, please feel free to pick up a copy, and I think that he will even autograph them. Yeah, okay. Turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. So I really enjoyed listening to Dr. Black's presentation earlier, and I'll try to bring in a couple of comments as it reflects on my work, because what he provided you with was a very good background to what I'm going to be talking about and what I'm trying to do, and other scholars such as myself are also trying to do in the field of Civil War studies. So my book's title is In God's Presence, Chaplains, Missionaries, and Religious Space During the American Civil War. So the idea here is to take spatial theory and try to infuse that theory within the American Civil War. American Civil War historians, by and large, don't tend to be theorists. Their work doesn't tend to be theory-centric. I'm trying to build a little bit of that theory to kind of reflect on the different arguments within the field. So I'll talk more about that, but that's really what I was trying to do with this work, and part of what I think this work does to add to the prevailing literature. I like to put objectives whenever I give a presentation because I think it helps focus everyone so we know where everything's going. So that's why these are here. When I present to students, I also put objectives as well. The other thing I'd like to say is if you do have questions, I built this presentation so that you can ask questions along the way, and my guess is you might have a variety of questions. So feel free to just ask away. I probably won't stop and say, do you have any questions? I just like to hear whenever you have a question, and then I'll call on you and we can just have a conversation. That's what I hope to do here. So objectives. Discuss the development of the book, In God's Presence, Chaplains, Missionaries, and Religious Space during the American Civil War, from idea to completed book. And this took about 12 years, from kind of inception in graduate school to published book that you see before you. Okay, so it was a long process, and there are many points along the way where I made decisions about the final work. So I'd like to talk about that because I think that part is quite interesting. I want to talk about main arguments within the book itself. What was I arguing with the evidence that I had, and finally look at the worldview of Civil War chaplains and missionaries. Okay, kind of have a sense of who these individuals were, what they stood for, where they were coming from, and really what they were trying to do in the Civil War and beyond. Now, this is a Civil War book. I do talk about the antebellum period. I discuss the postbellum period, but this is a Civil War-centric book. And that's where for me, the story lies for these figures. And I do kind of think about, conceive of impact on post-war religious landscape as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a little activity first, okay? So this is going to get us to talk to our neighbors. So here's what I want to see kind of when you think of some of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about today. So chaplains and missionaries, what comes to mind? So again, this is just what you think about. And based on what your knowledge is right now about this topic, try to answer these questions. So if you could pair up with the person next to you, I mean, you can move if you want, but if you don't have somebody next to you, but pick a partner, okay? Does everybody have a partner? Okay. If you want to move, you can move. It's okay. Before we talk, it's great that you guys are talking to other people immediately, but first I want to make sure everybody's clear on the instructions, and then you'll have plenty of time to talk. Okay, so everybody's got a partner. I want you to think, first of all, initial thoughts about how would you define these two words. So chaplain or missionary. First I want you to think yourself for maybe a minute or so and what you think a chaplain might be or a missionary might be, and then talk to your partner based on what you think about the terms, and then try to come up with two definitions with your partner. Okay, so think about it yourself, then talk to your partner, and come up with a definition for each one of those terms. And then after that, if you have time, think about these questions, and we'll talk about them as a group. Is everybody clear? Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to work on that. Is one group commissioned, maybe? In official capacity? Do they have a commission? Does one group have a commission? And do they have like an official capacity, maybe from? Oh, okay. Okay.
But were they all hired?
Okay, good. Good. If you define the terms, then you could look at the discussion. Okay. All right. All right. I know who to call on that. How are we doing? Does everybody have definitions? Are we still working on the definitions? Okay, why don't we reconvene? Let's see what we come up with. See what we come up with as a group. Okay. So first of all, would somebody like to define chaplain? Yes, sir. All right. Would anybody like to add to that definition? Yes, sir, in the back. Okay, that's great. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Yes. Okay. All right. Ordination, formal training. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Well, let's focus. So I heard assignment of the faith of the chaplain, and then I heard another participant say to any of the soldiers. So what do we think? What do we think it might be in the Civil War, for example? Because I'll talk about this more. Can you do both, or is it? Okay, we're going to talk about Father Corby. Yes. Yes. Okay, so could you tell me more about that? Okay, 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 great. So the notion of being commissioned. So are these chaplains commissioned? Yes, they would be. What about a missionary then? let's move into the missionaries. So I think we have a good sense of the chaplaincy. What about a missionary then? Yes. Okay. All right, good. What about the time frame of a missionary versus a chaplain? Like how long you would be in the field, for example, or serving at a hospital. Yes, ma'am? Okay. So there might be some individuals that might be out longer, but we're going to talk about the Christian Commission as part of my presentation today. And they were temporary workers. And the reason they served as delegates, they were called delegates temporarily, is because a lot of them had congregations at home. And they couldn't leave for long periods of time. So, for example, these individuals couldn't necessarily commit to being a chaplain, okay? Because a chaplain could be a substantial time commitment. Whereas a missionary, since they're going to be commissioned, they're not going to be commissioned. They're going to be sent by churches at home for a lot of times a smaller amount of time. They're going to be able to just serve for a small period of time and then serve their time and then go back to their congregations. So that's going to be a major difference between the chaplaincy and the missionaries during the Civil War period. Yes? Okay, yes, and that also is true during the American Civil War, exactly what you said. Yes, sir. That, that's great. Mhm. Right. Correct, and in a sense, they're performing much of the same spiritual duties, whether you're a chaplain or a missionary. And if you're a soldier in the field and you would like spiritual guidance, you're going to go to the individual that's available to you, whether that be a missionary or a chaplain. Okay, yes, and so there's a blurring of the lines. That's exactly right. So I think we have a sense of who these two groups are, chaplains and missionaries. So I think we also understand now, because I think we answered this one, how are chaplains and missionaries similar and how are they different? Does anybody have any questions about similarities or differences between chaplains and missionaries? Okay, good. Now, let's move back. We talked a little bit about this, but I want to add a little bit more. Maybe you have some thoughts. How do you think chaplains and missionaries functioned during the American Civil War? Yes, sir. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Or if he's in a hospital or in a prison and you minister to whoever is there. Um, so, yes. Yes, sir. So, yes, you did have missionaries serve in those areas. You did have chaplains that were assigned to hospitals. There were chaplains who were imprisoned, um, and they ministered to men. There were also missionaries that were outside of prisons that went into prisons to missionary to missionize, to minister to troops as well. So yes, it's all part of the blurring of the lines. That was a really great comment. Yes. That's true as well. Does anybody know how that might work? I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. but how would a chaplain be kind of a cheerleader for soldiers? Services. And what's the goal of a service before a battle? Oh, yes. So providential thinking, yes, absolutely. Yes. Absolutely, because you might die if you're going into battle. Yes.
Connected to that, we want undistracted soldiers. So if you're worried about your salvation, you're a lousy soldier. Let's put that off to the side and get to business.
Okay. So focus on what you need to do. And your spiritual leader might provide absolution. Okay, we'll talk about that. Yes. Okay, so yes, I say both groups would convert, but I think the missionaries are much more focused on conversion. You're absolutely right. And think about who they have available to them. And we're going to talk about that too. Think about how many men are there in kind of winter camp, for example, or just waiting between battles. And that's a lot of what I talk about. Yes, sir. Yes. Right. We do have accounts of that, absolutely. And definitely chaplains and missionaries putting themselves in harm's way to provide spiritual assistance. Yes. I would say percentage-wise, yes, but we would see within both types of churches. We would see missionaries as well as chaplains. Okay, so let me talk about the book. So this is great. It seems to me that everybody in this room has a very good sense of chaplaincy, missionaries, what they were about in the Civil War period. So let me talk about the book. So for me, the Civil War was just something that I was really interested in, really from middle school, and it was just kind of, what am I going to do with it? Okay, what is going to be my what can I do? I wasn't really I liked battles, but I wasn't somebody that was going to just write about battles. Like I was not going to write that book. I wanted to talk about something related to kind of social history. That's really what my focus was. So I went to undergrad in Virginia, and we were in Virginia. At William Mary, was very interested in colonial revolutionary war, but we did. There was a lot of people that were interested in the Civil War. I took classes in Civil War history, 19th century. I also took classes in religion. Okay, I was always fascinated by religion, and I took a wide, diverse array of courses in religion as an undergraduate. In graduate school, I went and got a degree in Judaic studies because I was really interested in Judaic studies at the time when I finished undergrad. So I got a master's in Judaic studies. And then I was considering doing a Judaic studies topic on the American Civil War. Now you're thinking, you were interested in a Judaic studies topic, but you wrote a book about Christianity during the American Civil War, right? That's the question, right? So, well, I was also interested in Christianity. I always have like these wide-ranging interests. So I was thinking, actually, I did a master's thesis on the rabbinate during the American Civil War, and the role of the press, the Jewish press, and the rabbinate. So when Dr. Black was talking about kind of this pro-slavery argument within the churches, it also existed in the rabbinate. among the Southern Jewish leadership as well. And it's very prominent in the literature, okay? So it was geographic. So it moves beyond Christianity. It incorporated American Southern Jews as well. Anyway, I found that an interesting topic, but I really wanted to move broader, okay? And the larger, and I was interested in the leaders, okay? So the larger group of religious leaders are going to be Christians, okay? I was very fascinated in that. And then when I went on to school at the University of Florida, I took additional coursework in American religious history, okay? And from that, I built a topic around chaplains, missionaries, and initially I was going to incorporate Jewish chaplains as well, which there were very small number, because initially Jews could not serve as chaplains initially in the conflict. That was changed later. So we do have, but again, it's kind of about numbers there. So there was a time when I wanted to incorporate that story, but another historian had already written that book. Actually, a couple of historians had already written that book. So I was going to focus really on the chaplaincy, Christian chaplains, okay? And there were so many resources, and it was such a fascinating story. I was really fascinated, riveted by it. So I wanted to tell that story within the American Civil War context, okay? So what that meant was substantial amount of primary source and secondary source research. And then, as Dr. Black was talking to everyone about today, preparing reading lists and making sure I had a good grounding of the historiography related to American religious history and American Civil War history. And I'm sure all of you are aware, the literature on the American Civil War, in many cases, is quite vast. So you have to kind of figure out what is relevant to the topic that you're working on, okay? So all that was done. I created a dissertation. I defended my dissertation in graduate school. Before I finished with graduate school, I was working as a prep school teacher in South Florida, okay? So I was figuring out how to maintain, I had a very heavy teaching load, and also spend time on research and writing. And you know, it really kind of kept me focused on what the end goal was, and the end goal always was, once I finished my PhD, to revise the dissertation and write the book. That was always going to be my end goal. In addition, so I did that for a number of years, and now I'm working as an adjunct instructor at the community college level. So I teach world history and I teach United States history. And I predominantly teach world history at this point, which I find also very interesting. So during that time, I was really kind of focused on getting this book completed. So that's kind of the story of the book, and that's why it took 12 years to complete, because there were a variety of things that I was working on at different times. Does anybody have questions about that? Let's talk about sources. Sources are key to this project, okay? And in some cases, sources I've used, I'm not sure other people have used within a monograph of this size. For example, some of the sources in the National Archives, some of the chaplains' reports, some of the USCC delegate reports. So there's been multiple dissertations on the United States Christian Commission, but I'm not sure that anybody has published a standalone scholarly monograph on it yet. So some secondary sources, Mark Knoll, Harry Stout, Steve Woodworth, George Rabel, already discussed earlier by Dr. Black, all great sources. Harry Stout took a seminar with him at Calvin College a few years back on civil religion. Very fascinating, and that was right after he published his book, Moral History of the American Civil War, which is quite fascinating. And then really this book is about primary sources, though. diaries and letters, and there's tons of diaries and letters. The great thing about the Civil War is so much of it is published. So depending on what study you're doing, you can get a lot of great primary sources from all these edited collections that have come out over the years in the American Civil War, including discussions of religion during the American Civil War. So I went all over the place. I went to the South. I went to Duke. I went to Emory. I went to the Georgia Department of Archives. I also went to UNC Chapel Hill, the Southern Historical Collection. Now, one thing I really wanted to do was to bring in the story of the Southern missionaries, but it was hard to do. Can anybody guess why? So, okay, so right, it's a challenge to find the records. Correct. The great thing about looking at the North, though, is there's certain repositories of great primary source material. Does anybody know what one of them might be? We're close to Carlisle. Yeah, Carlisle is amazing. And if you haven't had a chance to go to Carlisle, you really should take a look at their archives. Amazing for anything related to war that U.S. troops have been involved in. What else is close to us? National Archives, yes, and Library of Congress, absolutely. Okay, and I spent a lot of time in those places as well. So I was looking for letters. I was looking for diaries. I was also looking for reports. I looked at pension records as well, and the hospital chaplain reports. I really enjoyed going through, and none of those were transcribed. So yeah, I had to look through the handwriting. But I thought that was fun because I found some really good, interesting analysis, and all those came later in the war as well. Okay, which is also quite fascinating. There was an order that said you guys have to write up these reports later in the war and submit them to the Surgeon General, I believe, was collecting all these, and then they all got collected and they all ended up in the National Archives. So you can go there and you can look at all these sources, which I found fascinating. So that's about sources. Any questions about that? Yes, sir. I would say I looked through hundreds of them. I have more of them that I haven't looked through. I compiled so many sources. I probably got through about 60% of the primaries that I collected over time. There's so much out there, really. That's a great question. So here's the book. Here's what I was trying to do in the book. I was looking at different spaces, okay? And I was trying to distill this literature on sacred and profane space and contested space. And there's a lot of it. And I came up with my own concept of what these spaces would mean within my work, okay? So sacred space contains religious power, and the key here is created by lay or ordained clergy. So I was looking at the leadership of the clerical figure. So that could be a missionary, that could be a chaplain, and how they created this religious space, okay? Who worship within the bounded area. So it's a bounded area. It's not just totally open. There's a certain bound to it. You understand that this is a religious space, okay? And there's an inclusivity, okay? During the war, and this is one of my primary points, there is an inclusivity. So before the war, if you were not a member of a specific denomination, did you worship in that church? Not usually. What do you think changes during the war? Right, right. And you're all fighting to win the conflict, right? So we're going to see a bridging of the divide, the antebellum divide, within these different spaces. And that's a primary argument that I'm going to be making, okay? Inclusive of race, gender, and class. Now, there's not that many women that appear in my book, but there are a few. Bastions of democracy within this rigid hierarchy within the Army, okay? And the key also is the rituals that are being done. Okay, that's your sacred space. Okay, the profane space is the clerical influence isn't there. Okay, and it's about vice. And vice in this time period, primary vices would be gambling, profanity, drunkenness. Okay, there's other vices as well. Those are your primary vices that you're going to see in the camp. Okay, contested space. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. So the blurring comment, that's so good. I really like that comment. Contested space is where we see a lot of this within these different spaces. Okay, so the sacred and the profane blur. So how do we make this happen? How do we make a purely religious space for worship in the middle of an active campaign when there's lots of people milling around doing a variety of different things? So how does that work? Well, that's where our contested space comes in a lot of times, okay? The battlefield where men fought at the same place and time that clergy delivered last rites and absolution, okay? So there's a clerical figure delivering absolution. At the same time, there's a battle going on. How does that work, okay? Clergy supporting their army's cause and basically saying that combat is not a bad thing because the cause is just. And I think that was brought up earlier. So this is the contested idea here. So the blurring of lines. And we see there's a lot of this going on within the Civil War armies and the Civil War spaces that I'm going to talk about. But first, I want to give you a very short clip. And this is from...
The soldiers of both North and South that served in the American Civil War obviously served with a number of reasons in mind. One such factor that is often overlooked is the idea of religion or spiritualism, factors which many of them had grown up with in their youth. Whether a recruit was Protestant or Catholic or Jewish, many of them served with a similar conviction in mind, regardless of what side they were on. They all thought that God was on their side. And after all, both the Union and the Confederacy hosted national days of prayer, national days of fast, and numerous religious services. But what motivated these religiously devout people to embark in this wholesale slaughter of fellow Americans? It's an important question for us to consider, even 150 years later. There are many people throughout the North who go to war for numerous reasons. A small number of them include those that are opposed to the institution of slavery, known as abolitionists. They believe that this war comes about as a form of punishment coming down from God for the sins of slavery and for allowing this nation that prides itself on freedom from allowing it to grow and expand into new territories. But for a large portion of the northern people, they think of even higher ideals in mind. The idea of union served as a beacon of sorts to individual liberty and religious freedom. And Northerners believed that if they could win this war, that they could not only perfect their own society, but pave the way for God's kingdom here on earth. At the same time, Confederates thought that their new nation was the one true Christian nation, and Confederate leaders were not hesitant at all to invoke God's name in their call, either in their Constitution or in their national motto, which was Dio Vindici, meaning with God as our defender. At the same time, Southerners used numerous Bible passages to promote and defend the institution of slavery, attempting to assert a moral and spiritual backbone to the institution that defined Southern society. Guiding these hundreds of thousands of soldiers out in the field in order to provide spiritual and moral comfort were perhaps as many as 4,000 chaplains of numerous denominations. Some preachers and ministers decided to share the views of their respective countries from the pulpit. Others would actually join troops and go out into the field, some of them even taking up weapons or leading men into combat. One such general was Confederate leader Leonidas Polk, who led men into battle, albeit not that successfully. But even so, like so many of his fellow Confederate soldiers, he too gave up his life in the name of his God and country. Perhaps the most famous of these chaplains is the Catholic priest depicted behind me, a priest by the name of Father William Corby. at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, as well as the Battle of Gettysburg right here in 1863. He went before his fellow members of the Irish Brigade, and he spoke to them before they were being deployed into battle. In what was perhaps one of the final moments of many of their lives, he went before them, shared in a moment of prayer, gave them the final act of absolution, giving them forgiveness for any of their sins, and he also gave a stern warning to any of those shirkers or potential deserters who turned away in the face of the enemy, that they would not be welcomed into the gates of heaven. This is a very revealing moment in regard to the religious lives of Civil War soldiers. It tells us not only what they were doing and thinking in the final moments of their lives or in this desperate hour of their lifetime, it also tells us about the times in which they grew up, the devout religious societies that they lived in, and the strong conviction that they not only had in their country, but in their God.
Yes. So the notion is each side believed that God was on their side, but then can God be on both sides at the same time? That is a great point. Yes. Right. The notion, religion has been important in battle for a long time, prior to the American Civil War. It shouldn't surprise us that it was significant during the American Civil War as well. Okay, so here's the overview of how I conceived of this. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a work that if you didn't know a lot about this topic, you could read a couple of chapters at the beginning and get up to speed in order to understand the duration of the book. So I talk about the worldviews of the clergy as well as soldiers in the first, they're shorter chapters, and then I talk about space, and I talk about what's going on. I talk about the camp. The camp has two separate chapters. One is just talking about worship practices. One is talking about kind of building churches, fighting battles, and also thinking about diversity. Okay, diversity within the Civil War, which is very important. And then here. How are chaplains and missionaries ministering to people that are fighting, dying, sick, wounded? And then finally I look at general hospitals and prisons, and I look at civil religion. Okay? I'm very interested in civil religion and how that develops, because civil religion becomes increasingly important after the American Civil War. Does anybody have an example of how that might work? What I'm talking about in terms of civil religion? Yes. Potentially, let's go even broader than that, even more kind of macro level. What kind of movements are going on after the Civil War? Yes. Okay. Okay. Has anybody heard of the religion of the lost cause? Okay. And yes. As kind of part of the religion of the lost cause. Right, and so Charles Reagan Wilson's book, Baptized in Blood, does a great job of discussing that. Yes? Okay, who might be a quote-unquote kind of messiah of a civil religion in the North? Yes. Yes, Lincoln. Absolutely. Okay, yes. We're going to see more of this really, and my argument is we see it in hospitals and also in prisons. In other places within the camp as well, but in those places, especially in the general hospital, okay? And that becomes even more important in understanding America after the American Civil War, okay? Yes? Correct, or Stonewall Jackson, or yes. Okay. All right, so I talk about that. So that's the structure here. Here are major arguments, okay? What I say is that they attempted to replicate the antebellum church within these different environments. Soldiers did, and also chaplains and missionaries. Do you think they were successful? Well, our theme here is blurring of the lines and different things. Do we think they were successful? Sometimes, to an extent, okay? To an extent. Okay, so certain things they were successful at, but certain things it just won't work. Okay, this is wartime. We're in the camp. We're in the general hospital. We're in the prison. It's not going to be the same. Okay, so in many cases, it's a new religious world, and it's a world that can't necessarily exist after the Civil War either. It's kind of a world that develops during the war, and certain things continue postbellum, but certain things don't. It's kind of a wartime moment. Okay, does this happen when we think about wars today? There's something about the circumstances of warfare itself that create environments, and we see that. Okay, we see that here. So what's happening? What I argue in the antebellum period, there's this focus on a static kind of physical space. I go to a church. That's where I pray. Okay, that's where I see the minister. But in the camp, it's not going to necessarily work that way because you might not have a static space. You might the preacher might have to move around. Okay, due to you're on active campaign. How can you build a church while you're an actual physical church? How can you build a physical church while you're on campaign? And you can do that, and you can move around, right? Something has to be able to be moved around, okay? And that's really important when we're thinking about this, okay? So dynamic sacred spaces, and again, who's controlling the meaning of these spaces? Well, that would be your clergy, okay? Now, this is a male world. Where are the women? Yes. So there will be some women. But in terms of numbers, right, we're talking about a male population with some women, but mainly men. So do you have to change the message? Does a chaplain or a missionary think about men or women within the church community differently? Do you have to maybe adapt what you're going to say? Do you think sermons kind of focus on, what's going on in these soldiers' lives and try to get them engaged? Yes. So the focal point of sermons, they're going to talk a lot about vulgarity and gambling and dangers within the camp, and they're going to also talk about salvation, and it's going to be focused, the message is going to be focused on what's going on with these men within these environments, okay? It's very important. The other thing that's important is ecumenism. What do I mean by that term? Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Absolutely. So there are services that are documented with multiple chaplains of different denominations. Would that be something you would see in the antebellum period? Right. Right. So this I conceive of as really important, okay? Ministering to all men. We see a lot of chaplains and missionaries not thinking about race or class considerations at all, okay, in terms of or denomination, okay. So we have accounts of soldiers saying, "I want my regimental chaplain to help me out because I like my regimental chaplain. It doesn't matter that he's a different denomination. I still want him to be next to me when I'm about to die," okay. The notion of the good death, okay. Drew Faust wrote a brilliant work about this. About the good death and how everybody in the antebellum period, you know, in moving into the Civil War and postbellum, was interested in the good death, okay? Having their family and friends surrounding them when they die. Well, here's the thing. If you're in battle and you get shot and you're going to die in 15 minutes, what's your good death look like? Are you going to have your family and everybody's, yes? Right. That's right. Absolutely. So this is where the chaplain or missionary is key, because they can be on hand and make sure that you're able to say whatever you need to say before you die. Okay? Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, that's. Correct. Okay, great. So the letters, yes, chaplains, missionaries, the United States Christian Commission is going to be very important in this work, notifying people. Okay, there's so many people that are going to die in this this conflict, and in many cases, so many people over just 1, 2, 3 days at the Battle of Gettysburg, for example. How are you going to make sure that everybody's informed and everybody gets a letter talking about their son and how valiantly he served in the conflict? That's going to fall to the chaplain or missionary in many cases. Okay, revivalism. Dr. Black talked about revivalism. Super important in the conflict and during the Civil War. Why? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. Things are tough. Keep everyone motivated. And also, are they trying to save souls? Are they trying to missionize? Mhm. And do you think they have people that might not have been to church in a while at these revivals? They do. Okay. The Christian Commission is also known as the USCC. They're an evangelical organization. They're promoting ecumenism as well. And they have an interesting role here because they minister to non-English speaking soldiers, Native Americans, and African Americans. And I believe that their work is pivotal in what Daniel Saul talked about in terms of religious reconstruction. Okay? And also when we think about the work of the Freedmen's Bureau or the AMA, some of these groups, the Christian Commission is very important. Yes?
Ask a question about the relationship of Union chaplains to slavery. Not everybody who went to fight obviously was an abolitionist, but at some point the army becomes so-called practical liberators because it's the way it should.
Right.
Did you find evidence of chaplains adjusting their theology to match that reality?
So I found evidence of chaplains ministering to individuals that had run to the armies, or USCC delegates doing the same, trying to incorporate these individuals with and trying to save souls. But that is a very good point. Let's talk about who these guys were. Union chaplains. Okay, 2,398 individuals were commissioned. Okay, remember your chaplain will be commissioned. It's U.S. Army chaplains, U.S. Navy chaplains, or hospital chaplains of the U.S. Volunteers. 40% are Methodist, 17% Presbyterian, 12% Baptist. Okay, this is the Union. We also see African American clergy, Irish priests, Scottish Congregationalists, German Lutheran pastors, Jewish chaplains, a handful later in the conflict. Initially, they were not allowed to serve. Okay, so this is just a passage. I just wanted to give 3 short passages from my work, and I'll read it to you, and you can see what I'm looking at in terms of space and how I'm trying to analyze this. Okay, so active campaigning required clergy to provide new improvised worship spaces, distinct from the static spaces of the pre-war church, but in some ways quite similar to the spaces generated by antebellum revivals. Left without a church tent, and on the march in the spring of 1862, Union Chaplain Alexander Stewart's regiment found it necessary to establish a new Bethel. For 4 straight evenings, soldiers assembled in a grove of pine trees near the Chain Bridge in Northern Virginia. For up to 2 hours, they sang and prayed, intermingled with words of exhortation, admonition, and encouragement. According to Stewart, our condition, our place of worship, the overhanging trees, the surrounding darkness, dispelled for a circle by our campfire, all combined in giving a kind of unearthly charm, a peculiar interest and pleasure to our meetings. This Protestant space paralleled the Catholic sacred space improvised by Union Chaplain William Corby before the Battle of Gettysburg. The brigade had reached the base of a hill one Saturday night, and Corby wanted to celebrate Mass the next day on its summit. The men enthusiastically helped prepare the ground and, after holding Mass, marked the place with a cross. As these 2 examples suggest, this dynamic, improvised space contained the same ritualistic power as the static space of the antebellum church. So what I'm trying to do is draw comparisons between what's going on in the antebellum period and also what's going on in the war, and thinking about how adaptations are being made. Okay, so this is an example of what would be improvised. Why do they have to improvise? Sure. Yeah. It's time. It's an issue of time. So this is at Gettysburg, and you can visit this space. This is Father William Corby commemorating absolution given to the troops on July 2nd of 1863. Okay. Christian Commission. Okay. I found the Christian Commission to have such an abundance of resources. There's so much out there on the Christian Commission. They kept basically everything. Okay. If you go to the National Archives and also Library of Congress, you can find this material. It's an evangelical group founded at the urging of the New York Young Men's Christian Association in November 1861. So is this a wartime group? Yes, absolutely. It was formed. Volunteer delegates, and these we were talking about earlier, limited terms, 2 weeks on the battlefield, okay, or 6 weeks in hospital and camp. Okay, so these would be individuals that by and large had their own congregations, and they could go for a limited amount of time, but they had their congregations at home. And they needed to be at home as well, okay? They helped regimental and hospital chaplains, providing pastoral care, distributing tracts. So that's one thing that we haven't mentioned yet, the notion of tracts and how important that is. Worship services and physical needs, okay? If a soldier needs something, they might not get it from the Army, but the Christian Commission might be able to provide assistance, okay? Another group also provided assistance. Does anybody know the name of that? The Sanitary Commission as well. The Sanitary Commission went through leadership a lot of times. The Christian Commission went directly to the soldiers. They had a different philosophy in how they helped. USCC delegate distributed stores on average annually $5,535, and publications worth $1,487, attended 118 prayer meetings, preached 89 sermons, and wrote 140 letters for the soldiers. They were quite busy, okay? They came for a small amount of time, they worked really hard, and then they went home to their home churches, okay? Very important group. And this is an image of field headquarters of the Christian Commission. So soldier might be able to go to the field headquarters, might ask somebody to write a letter for them, provide supplies. They could write a letter as well if they got supplies. They might be able to get some food. They might be able to get some spiritual assistance. And these field headquarters were set up throughout the armies in the Union. Okay, so big thing with the delegates, though. I'll read this one as well. Chapel construction. Okay, why chapels? Yes. Yes. Yes, and could you potentially dismantle these and move them? And yes. Yes. Very important. Okay? So while individual chaplains had limited time and resources to build chapels, USCC delegates drew on their vast resources to build chapels that rivaled any pre-war church's workmanship. Built in the winter of 1864 to 1865 near the front in Virginia, Meade Station's chapel was an impressive 23 by 43 feet, having on the front a porch 6 by 7 mounted with a belfry and spire 15 feet high, made of small pine poles arranged in squares and triangles. Seats made of rough pine boards faced the pulpit. A 5-foot wide breastwork supported by several columns. The columns and spaces between are richly ornamented with pine rods, the USCC's official description read. So artistically arranged as to present one of the most novel and beautiful pulpits ever preached in. A Union soldier who helped build this chapel explained its effect on his subsequent religious life. I have been converted here. I've been home since and united with the old church, Dr. Plummer's in Allegheny City. But I can never, never forget this chapel. It has been the gate of heaven to me. Okay, so what's the role here of these chapels? Yes. Okay. Okay. Okay, good. All right, so we're going to have periods of stability. Winter quarters might be another time that they could build more elaborate structures as well. But the goal here is to have so that people are comfortable with this space that's set apart from other aspects of the camp, okay? And the USCC, big in this. Let's talk about chaplains in terms of the Confederacy. Okay. Look, Confederate chaplains, and see if we note any differences between the denominations represented here. Okay, 1,308 chaplains served. Okay, only 42% were fully ordained. Okay, 47% Methodist, 18% Presbyterian, 16% Baptist, 10% Episcopalian, 3% Roman Catholic, and 1% for 5 other denominations. What do we notice here? Mm-hmm. Remember, this is the chaplaincy. This is not the missionaries. So remember that as well. And it's hard to track Confederate missionaries, okay, because their records are all over the place if they still exist at all. So let's talk about one. I found this one interesting because it's about it involves a prison. Okay, Confederate chaplain James Sheeran, a POW, and he's talking about fighting against profanity, obscenity, and gambling in a prison. Okay. Although inculcating religiosity was not difficult, clergy still had to fight profane influences in the prison environment, just as they did in the camp, the hospital, and the pre-war church community. As historian George Rabel explains, blasphemous and profane speech permeated the prison, and irreverent soldiers often disturbed worship services there. These vices detracted from the ministry of the clergy and the spiritual attention of the imprisoned. While imprisoned at Baltimore's Fort McHenry, Confederate chaplain James Sheeran preached on 2 occasions. On Sunday, November 13th, 1864, he spoke against profanity, obscenity, and gambling, specifically exhorting his audience, quote, to discontinue their obscene and profane language, if for no higher reason, at least through respect for their fellow prisoners. A week later, Sheeran continued his tirade against profane influences, stating, I know not where my words or ideas came from on that occasion, but it appears to me that I pictured the vices of impurity and profanity in such colors that even the most abandoned would feel ashamed of themselves. Okay. So what do we think here? Sure. I would say, remember also that the numbers I gave you were for the chaplaincy and not for the missionary groups as well, where we would see a bit more diversity within the missionaries that are coming into the armies for both sides. Yes? Isolated groups that came in from different churches throughout the South. So yes, so this is the other thing. The Union had a much stronger kind of administrative apparatus in terms of delivering religious ministrations to the soldiers, and they had a lot more supplies available as well. So there's no group that takes the place of the USCC in the South. The USCC occasionally would help out Southern soldiers. But we do not see a group that's organized in this fashion in the South. Okay. Postbellum. So we talked about the war. I want to talk about postbellum, and we'll have probably a couple minutes if there's any questions. So why is the war important? So I'm going to say that the wartime armies are cauldrons of male religiosity. Okay, there's very few women that are present. They did not translate into a post-war shift toward the masculinization of religious adherence, with men and women worshiping God in equal numbers. Okay, we do not see that in the postbellum period. Even though a lot of men are involved during wartime, that doesn't translate to the numbers in the immediate post-war period. Okay, pragmatic ecumenism in wartime environments. This notion of inclusivity that we're going to see, a chaplain or missionary ministering to everybody in the regiment and not just thinking about denomination, will dissipate. But sectarianism is not as pronounced as it was in the antebellum period. Okay, again, religious and societal equality in war will also dissipate. Ideas of the good death, which the chaplain or missionary was involved in, would related to postbellum interest in memorialization of the dead. Okay, and there's lots of talk about that in the scholarship. And the USCC's wartime work, I would argue, really serves as a foundation of religious reconstruction. Okay, chaplain and missionaries will work to fight profane influences, and that's going to be continued postbellum by temperance organizations. Okay, holidays. Talk a bit about holidays. Some holidays are observed for the first time in Civil War camps, and they're going to become important in postbellum era. For example, Christmas. Okay, we're starting to see soldiers being exposed to Christmas in the camps, and then that's going to be very important post-war. Civil religion. In the general hospitals and prisons is going to influence, as we discussed before, religion of the lost cause, northern civil religion, okay? I think this part is really important. And then strong interest in revivalism during the war, and that will continue, okay? As Dr. Black has already talked to you about revivalism before the Civil War. It's going to continue, okay? So these are all kind of postbellum ideas. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. I would say that they would not volunteer to serve unless they could perform the duties. And to be able to be literate was something that you needed to be able to write. Otherwise, you really couldn't perform your role as a missionary. You didn't need to be ordained. And again, we looked at a number of the chaplains in the Confederacy are not ordained, but you did need to be literate. Yes. I can look it up for you because I have a book at home and I have all the chaplains. But if you send me an email, I'll look it up for you. Yes, in the back. So even though there would be missionaries that could be in the field for a substantial amount of time, your chaplain, just within the chaplain or missionary dynamic or within the... Okay, the difference between North and South. I think in terms of resources, the South did not have the resources that the North had. Okay, so when we think about the chapel flies, these mobile spaces that are going to be moved around that the USCC is building, the South did not have access to the same numbers. And a lot of times the South was relying on local resources. So sometimes there would be local preachers that would come into the Southern armies and help out, or into prisons, or into hospitals. The North had a lot more resources, and they were able to mobilize people better due to the infrastructure that they had. That's really the major. All of them were very interested in conversion and ministering to troops, but one side had just amazing resource. And that we think about that in terms of the Northern armies and the Southern armies in general. And that translated also to the notion of religion and how religion was, how people's spiritual guidance was given to soldiers during the war as well, due to that infrastructure. Yes? Right. Some soldiers are going to get better care from clergy just because there's more resources in a certain area. Yes, it's not centralized. Yes. I've seen those. Yes. Not everybody's happy. Some of those are early chaplains that get booted out. Not all the chaplains stayed through for a long period of time. Some of them got homesick. Some of them were inept. But yes, there are some soldiers that were very unhappy with the care that they got from their chaplain. Yeah. Yes. So that's a great question. I would have to do some research on that. That is a really good question. Yes. So they wrote their name, they wrote the date, They wrote usually a paragraph or two. A lot of it was statistics, but occasionally the really good ones for me are the anecdotes. They provided like some anecdotes that talked about what they did, and then it was submitted. So it was usually a monthly report that I saw, particularly for the general hospitals. Yes. Correct. Yes.
I know that post-World War II, there was an increased interest in religious life due to some of the experiences. Was there a post-bellum interest in increased interest in becoming a minister or a priest after the war? I didn't see that listed.
So I haven't done the research on that to see the numbers and the change in terms of people going to seminary, for example, as a result of wartime experiences. I think that would be something to look into. I just don't have the numbers for you. Yes. Jackie, you can. All right. Thank you so much. If you have additional questions, I'm happy to answer them.
And there'll be time for questions later on during the panel discussion. We are going to move on to lunch right now. Lunch is going to be upstairs on the second floor in room 206, and we can help direct you there. There are the stairs right out here. If you need to use the elevator, we can direct you to that, show you where that is. We're going to start the first Schmucker House tour at 12:30. I also forgot to mention that we have a special cupola tour running at 1 o'clock. So if you're interested in going up to the cupola at 1 o'clock, please head over to the museum and get your name on their list in advance of that. Yes. We're not locking the room. You can leave, but it's sort of at your own risk.